Hey guys, and welcome back to the Mudstudsskullcaps podcast. I'm Robin.
And I'm Kelsey. And in today's episode, we are going to do a deep dive into the topic of being on the bit and why we need to take a hard look at ourselves and the riders we idolize and ask, why is hyper-flexion becoming more and more common? So I want to start this conversation by asking you the question of what is your view on hyperflexion? Is this something that, and actually, I guess I want to back up even further. We're going to define this term we'll define the term in just a second. But when I'm talking hyperflexion in today's episode, we are not talking about rollker. We're talking about it in a much smaller degree, but still your horse is behind the vertical. So when we talk about hyperflexion, it's really about that horse being behind the vertical. So for you, what is your view of hyperflexion? Is this something that you use occasionally? I avoid at all costs? Like, what is your view of it?
As I'm getting older, it's something I avoid at all costs. And when I was younger, it was something I thought I was avoiding at all costs. And yet, what I conceived as they were no longer behind vertical, they were still behind vertical. So it's something that I've been trying to correct continuously because I think, especially with Trin, as we started her ourselves, I think we taught her really wrong, and that we taught her to go behind the vertical way too frequently, and that's something I've been trying to unteach constantly. And I think it's just people default to it a lot more than they should.
Yeah, and I think, like, for me, I think I was the same way, right? The older I'm becoming, the more, like, I'm even to the point where it's like, I want that throat open even more. Like, like, I look at so many pictures and I'm like, just lengthen your reins 1 inch and just open that throat just a little bit more. So I feel like I'm becoming very, like, almost extremely the, opposite of, behind the vertical is, I don't mind a little in front of the vertical, actually, if my horse is, like, open in the throat and happy. And I think what we did with Trin was that we started her long, low, and deep. Was the problem is that, and that was where I was using hyperflexion the most, was I was allowing my horses to get too deep and also encouraging them to get too deep, thinking I was going to get a better back stretch out of that I was doing. My horse was going to be working their top line more actively if they were lower down and deeper, which unfortunately is actually just not the truth. Their bodies just don't work that way.
Right. And I found that I have changed where my eye goes and looks to tell if a horse is on the bit, or not even on the bit, but I've changed where I go to look to see where the horse is hyperflex and if they're using the muscles of their body correctly, in which previously I would just look at the arc of their neck. And a lot of times, that will tell you if they are just cranking their head in or not. But now I've realized I need to look at their throat latch, see if their throat is open, and then on top of that, looking right in front of the withers, if that is hollowed out or not. And that has really changed my perspective on hyperflexion, because if your horse is even slightly behind vertical, either their throat latch is going to be closed, or they're going to be hollowed out in front of the withers, or they're going to be both.
I really wish you could look behind you when you rode. Like, I really want to just look at my horse's back and lumbar and be like, are you lifting or are you dropped? Like, what is the angle of your back right now? Because, right, their back should be level.
Yeah.
And I see so many, like, times when the horse looks great in front of the saddle, but their back is, like, dropped out and it just looks like, a hill or a cliff or something from the point of the top of the bottom towards the saddle, right? Like, totally drops. And to me, like, I wish I could see that just to make sure that my horse is actually level when I'm riding them. So that's like a pain in the butt that I can't see behind me because, right, everything actually starts behind you. It doesn't start in front of you.
And it's frustrating because part of this wanting to look behind you is you want to see when they're actually doing it so you can correlate, like, what does it feel like? What does it actually feel like with them lifting their back? Because I know I don't experience it often enough. But I remember being in a lesson once, and my horse, of course, stopped to poop, right? Or was walking and pooping. And my instructor, he told me, that is how you want their back to feel. I mean, obviously, pooping, it's a little bit exaggerated, but they're having to fully lift their back to squeeze that turd out.
Right. They're totally lifted to the loin at that point. They're not dropped out in their loin. And I think that gets so missed. And obviously, pooping is the extreme version, as you mentioned, like, right, there's other activities going on at that time, but I mean, they're fully engaged with their core and are like lifting and squeezing, so that's a good idea of what you're trying to feel.
It just gives you a sense of that feeling. Obviously, it's a little bit exaggerated and overdone when they're pooping, but that's something you should be striving for when you're riding. It's something to work towards that feeling. You won't get to that extreme, but you'll be able to tell when you're getting kind of closer to that feeling of where they're lifting their back underneath you. And you can actually feel them lifting the saddle. And it's a completely different feeling than what most of us are used to. And I mean, I know it's a different feeling than half of my ride typically is,
Yeah, no, and I could definitely, Dublin, we were getting there more and more frequently, so I don't remember every single ride we did it with Dublin, especially when we were getting working towards third level. But I do know exactly what it felt like on Dublin. There is a very specific way it feels on him, where just suddenly everything clicks on and he's lifted and he's soft and his neck is much bigger, especially at the withers. His neck has almost doubled in size, it seems like, and there's a much different feeling. But I remember getting it on other horses. Those are the time I also very specifically remember those rides where it was on a stranger horse or on one of the lesson ponies I used to ride and work. I would get it sometimes on them. And it's just that moment of you just feel so lofty, and the shoulders feel so different. You can really feel it in their shoulders when they change.
It has taken me until now, today, and even it's going to take me probably a couple years longer, and I'm just constantly going to be learning, but I'm just now really starting to figure out how to get Trin to be able to lift her back and engage her core, and we're getting it so much more often than we ever used to get it, and it feels so good. So I know when the feeling is happening. I know when we finally gotten there, because all of a sudden her jaw will relax and just her ears will relax and just the whole picture will relax, where I can feel when she's dropping in her croup or something, everything is tight. It feels like I'm riding a 2x4.
Right. And I think if you can't feel it in your whole body, the horse isn't doing it through their whole body. If all you can feel is, lightness in your hands, but you don't feel the change in your seat, then your horse isn't doing it. They're likely just evading the bit. So I think that's also a really good check, is do I feel this everywhere in my body, or do I just feel this in one place?
What's the definition of hyper-flexion?
I have definition for what I'm using as hyper-flexion, and also I have the definition for being on the bit. So we'll start with on the bit, since that's kind of that's the good. Let's start with the good. So this is really when a horse is on the bit. I don't have an issue with this phrase. I think there are definitely camps that have an issue with the phrase on the bit. And this is something this topic has actually been talked about a few times in the last week or two, versus on other podcasts, as well as in written material. I've seen a few articles on Facebook. But I don't have an issue with the term. It's just that the term needs to apply to the entire body. And I think sometimes when we hear just the term on the bit, all we're thinking is the front half of the horse, and we're not thinking about the back half of the horse. And so for me, on the bit is when the horse is truly lifting and placing their hind feet directly under their body in the hoof print of the leg in front of them, or in the front leg. Right? That made sense. Hind leg steps into the hoof print of the front leg left. They are stretched through their back and through their lumbar, and it's lifted. Think of that suspension bridge sort of image. And the poll is the highest point of that outline. So their neck may have a nice round look to it, but the poll is the highest point. And I think something riders get confused a lot of times, and even I get confused with sometimes when I'm looking at pictures, is when we're talking about poll being the highest point, where the poll, as in the physical structure of the vertebra, is the highest point, and then the following vertebra are below it. And I think sometimes when you look at photos, you see a really crusty horse or a horse with a lot of muscling, and that is higher than the poll, but we're not talking about the horse's mane being higher than the poll. We're talking about that vertebra and the poll not being flexed forward, because that's what you see a lot of times when you get into that overflexion or hyperflexion, is that the poll is then flexed forward and dropped, but it should be level when the horse is on the bit. That makes sense?
Yes, it does make sense. And the poll is something that it's a lot easier to look forward and see if your poll is dropped than to look behind you and see if their croup is dropped.
Right, and I think there is definitely, though, you have to make sure when you're looking at the poll being dropped, make sure you're looking at, I like to look at the angle of my brow band. Is my brow band pointed forward, or is it pointed up? And also this idea that, can I set a cup of water in between my horse's ears, and would that cup of water stay, or would it fall off? So you're really looking at levelness. Because you're going to look at a lot of photos, because I did this today. I Googled dressage photos, and a lot of times I think there's a lot of confusion over the horse's muscling, and his mane is not. That tends to sometimes still be the highest point, but it's the vertebra and how they connect. Because remember, the horse's neck vertebra drop to the bottom of their neck. They're not along the top of the neck. So then when we're talking about hyperflexion, and again, there's like 100 terms for this. So it's behind the bit, behind the vertical. Rollker is often lumped in here, but I'm going to again say rollker is something different, or it's just a more extreme version of this. I think 99.99999% of riders all agree rollker to that extreme hyperflexion is bad. But I think where we get in trouble is people use this low, deep round, like we mentioned, and think that's okay, or they think a slight overflexion is okay, or they just don't even notice where the horse is in relation to the vertical. So for this definition, we're just really talking about when the horse's nostrils drop behind the eyes, or the poll drops and is no longer the lowest or the highest point. That's what we're talking about when it comes to hyperflexion. Is this may only be a matter of inches versus, the horse's nose being cranked to its chest.
Right. And I think people commonly think with hyperflexion that if I'm doing it to a small degree, it's not an issue, or they think that it has to be this massive movement. There has to be this massive image that you see the horse's nose clearly behind the vertical. And that's not exactly what it is. That's not necessarily true.
Right. And I think our sort of, in the last couple of years, there has been a lot of outrage and, a lot of people very upset with seeing this rollker style of riding and seeing, the cranked flash nose bands, and the horse is clearly in stress as they're being ridden. And I think people see those images and go, oh, thank God I don't do that. My horse is not in that camp. And what they're not realizing is that, well, you are probably definitely not riding to that degree. You would know if you're riding like that. You probably aren't aware that you are experiencing overflexion or hyperflexion throughout your ride, right? Like if you're not hypersensitive to this and paying a lot of attention, it's likely happening, and it's happening either for moments or really commonly, and we can talk about this now or later, happens in warm-up. That's where we're seeing it the most, is people are using this as a warm-up method, and it's not a great warm-up method.
I have seen it, and I was actually at times taught to use it as a warm-up method.
Yeah.
It's very common that you see it happening.
Yeah, it is a common warm-up method, but I just want to throw this out there. How do you warm up for exercise? You don't start by stretching, and you don't start with the deepest, hardest stretch first, right? You take time to build up, and for you to touch your toes, right, may take weeks. And you know how much pain you're in the second you go to try to touch your toes and whoa, I am not as flexible as I thought I was. Well, those same things are happening to your horse. So when you do put your horse behind the vertical, the things that are going on with your horse biomechanically are that, first off, they're going to be engaging actually the bottom muscles on their neck. And that's a lot of times why we see these horses that are ridden behind the vertical have a really thick neck. And that's often when you're seeing horses that are ridden just slightly behind the vertical, because when you do rollker, basically everything turns off. But when you're just slightly behind the vertical, what you're doing is engaging the base of the horse's neck, or not the good base, but the bottom of the horse's neck. And those muscles are going to grow. And I think people then look at their horse after a few months and are like, wow, look how big his neck is. And, his muscling's in the wrong place, basically. They're not lifting muscles. Those are muscles that are getting big because of tension. Also, as soon as your horse comes behind, you're starting to close off his windpipe and his throat. He's going to have breathing problems. I mean, even you can practice tilting your chin to your chest, and you almost immediately notice that there's a difference with your windpipe and your ability to speak. And you're not cranked back or forced back. It's just that slight amount of pressure. The horse also has a lot of glands and things in that area of their throat, and all of those start to squeeze in on their windpipe. It also pulls your horse forward onto the forehand. They start to become heavier because they just, that neck is so heavy. A horse's head and neck is so heavy. And as soon as you change that balance, your horse is going to be on the forehand. That's just how it works. Also things depending how long you're doing it for and how to the degree of which your horse is flexed, you're going to see strain on the connective tissues, right? There's a big fear about damage to the first few vertebrae in the horse's neck. There's also, concerns about damaging the connective tissue that hold the muscles to the vertebra, or hold the muscles together as well as the vertebra together. And you're also going to cause like long-term damage to the support structures and the anchor points of those muscles and ligaments to the spine. And then things like their vision will be impacted because they can't look straight ahead of them. So there's like a lot of things that are happening that are not good when you ride in this position. And this is really, sometimes your horse gets there and it's not because you force them there, but it doesn't mean these things aren't still happening. Just because force wasn't used doesn't mean that this still isn't going on.
And I think that's something that should be addressed more often, because I commonly hear people, oh, my horse this is where they're more comfortable going in. Like,
what a lame excuse.
I know. And it's so common. I will grant some people that there has been one horse in my entire life that he felt more comfortable originally behind the vertical a little bit. But it wasn't because that's where he naturally chose to carry himself. It's because other trainers had put that onto him. And that was the only way he could figure out how to balance himself. And so I hear when people say, my horse feels more comfortable carrying himself here, that's why I warm up here. That's just not true. And so it's very frustrating that I think so many people want to immediately go on the defense and say that, well, my horse is the exception. This is just where they're more comfortable. This is their natural movement. This is what their breed determines where they should carry themselves. That's not a good defense. That doesn't make what's happening an excuse. It doesn't make what's happening acceptable.
So, yeah, some thoughts with that is behind the vertical, even if the horse naturally goes there, that's an evasion tactic. Your horse is they're either afraid of your bit or your hands because either the bit or the hands or both are too strong, or they don't have the muscles to hold themselves in a correct position. Their muscles are developed, aren't developed or were developed incorrectly, so it's easier, like you said, for them to go behind the vertical, or they've been trained to go there. But any way your horse gets there is still an invasion tactic, whether they decided to do it themselves or you've put them in that position. They're still evading that contact and invading that bit, and it's not good. I think the breed we most commonly see this as an issue with is Arabs.
Arabs and what's the other a lot of Spanish bred horses, like the Andalusians. Oh, I can't think. There's another breed. I can't remember what it is, but it's kind of along those lines that you see it happening in.
I won't discredit breeding from being part of the reason the horses do go there. Like, it may absolutely be a more natural thing because, especially if you look at how Arabs are ridden in the Western world or the performance world, they are ridden on purpose and bred on purpose to like break in their vertebra and keep that pull really low. So I will say there probably is some breeding that's going into impacting Arabs specifically to be more broken. But that doesn't mean that they can't be ridden in a more correct frame. It just means it's going to take a little bit more work for you as the rider, and you have to be that much more aware of it because, yes, Arabs do have a little bit of a tendency to ride behind the vertical naturally.
Yeah, and that was the one horse that I had that he felt a little bit more comfortable he was an Arab. And he just felt a little bit more comfortable in that position. But you still have to work on teaching them an easier way to carry their body that's less harmful to them.
Yeah, I mean, just because your horse likes to go there doesn't mean that's like the excuse, right? My horse likes to do lots of things like that's not good for them, right? Like, yes. If you own a thoroughbred, you've seen the cuts. Like, my horse likes to cut himself. I don't know why. It's also not great for him. So I'm going to try to avoid it. I'm going to take all the sharp things away. And so it's in that same thing. Like, your horse does, just because they like it or go there naturally sometimes, does not mean it's okay. We could talk a little bit more about the biomechanics of how the horse moves and what structures are involved. But I do want to address, because you did just mention it, this argument that I hear all the time, and dressage riders are super guilty of this, but I think riders on all disciplines are super guilty of this, and it needs to stop now, is using the argument that this is how my horse naturally moves, therefore it's okay. Like, even if you're talking about riding your horse correctly, that is not a good argument. Whose horse spends 40 minutes, practicing their piaffe and pirouettes 6 days a week? No horse does that willingly in their pasture. I'm sorry, but they don't overload their hind end and perform high collection movements in their pasture. Yes, your horse probably, when there's new mares in the pasture next door, will run up to the fence and prance in a very collected position for about 10 seconds, and then he goes back to eating. they're not doing this on their own, right, for an hour, 5 to 6 days a week. Yes, they naturally move that way, but for a very, very short period of time. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that this is not their natural, sustained way of moving, and that we take that, while it may be the most efficient way for them to move, especially with a rider, we need to take into consideration the effort and the training that goes to get them to be able to do that for a sustained period of time, and that it takes a long time to build that muscle, and that it's not something you can just start with day one.
Right. And it's frustrating because how many times growing up do we have it drilled into our heads that you have to have a 60-minute ride or at least 40 minutes ride? Like, it was just constantly drilled into your head that you need to be working your horses for this long, and your horse is going to get tired and eventually fall to the position of being behind the vertical or some way because they're just overexerting their muscles and they're exhausted, they're tired. And so we have to be very cognizant and aware of not overworking your horse and slowly building up that strength. That way they can hold it for a lot longer. But anything you're going to ask them to do, you have to build up the strength for, and it needs to come in short segments and not long, drawn out periods of training.
Right. Otherwise, then you are setting your horse up to evade the bit, because if you're overworking those muscles they have to evade because they can no longer support themselves because they're exhausted. So that's why it's so important that, you take the time to build that top line correctly so that the horse can do that work.
And then people feel that their horse is so much softer at the end of their ride when they're slightly behind the vertical or dropping, but it's not necessarily because they're softer. They've just gotten tired.
Right, and removed their mouth from making contact with the bit, right?
Yeah.
And that is something that, like, when I was doing a little bit of research on this topic the last couple of days, is something that kept coming up, is that there's a mistake riders are making they're mistaking evading the bit and going behind vertical for self-carriage, and they're not the same thing, as we highlighted. Self-carriage is not the absence of feeling. It is 100% feeling, but as you mentioned, it is feeling it everywhere. So if you are not feeling anything and you think that's correct, no, that's not correct. So do you want to give us a little bit of the biomechanics of how to correctly be on the bit and what's going on when your horse is in the good place?
I don't really have a super in-depth breakdown of it. Kind of what I was looking up and figuring out was how the rider needs to be holding their body and kind of what the horse needs to be doing before you can ever have them on the bit. And so we previously discussed the training pyramid and the basics. I think it kind of gets mixed up and confusing where on the bit comes into play, because a lot of people would think that it comes in right after contact on the training pyramid, because that makes sense. If you're going to have contact, you don't want your horse's head up in the air. This is when, if you have contact, you're going to be starting to place them on the bit. And in some regards, that's kind of true. But there's a lot more steps that have to happen before your horse gets on the bit, contact being one of them. And so in regards to training pyramid, is you first have to establish a good rhythm, and then you need to establish impulsion and having that energy, that forward momentum, and then you can establish your contact. After contact, straightness, and now once you have all those 4 previous steps, you can ask them to go on the bit.
Yeah, I absolutely. So I think this is a common misunderstanding riders make, is that contact is not on the bit. Contact is the rider and horse developing a feel of one another, and the horse starting to develop that seek. The horse is seeking the bit, they're seeking the contact, and the rider is there. And that contact, when we think about it on the training pyramid, really is more of that long grain. It's somewhere between a stretchy, chewy circle and being on the bit. That contact is the feel, and it's the support structure for being on the bit, but it's not physically being on the bit. You mentioned that it can't come until after straightness, which I don't disagree with. I think what we're seeing is so many riders trying to be on the bit and get their horse round, and I'm using air quotes, prior to establishing impulsion. You cannot have the horse round and on the bit without impulsion. And impulsion isn't speed. Impulsion is actually the horse engaging their haunches, and it's the first step of being on the bit. I think everyone has heard it so many times that it on the bit starts with the haunches. Well, what is that? That's impulsion. That's the horse actively lifting and placing its feet and having thrust in that movement. And to have thrust, you have to be stretched through that loin. And that's when you're going to see a horse that has impulsion also has this really round, beautiful bottom. Like their butt is it's perfectly round. A horse that doesn't have impulsion and is being ridden back to front has a very pointy butt. There seems to be you can see the stress of the muscles. You can see the tightness in the muscles. You can see the tightness in the fascia. And that's because the horse is just pulling its hind feet with them instead of thrusting and pushing and using those muscles. So if you're looking at your horse's hind end and it isn't gorgeous and round and plump, maybe they're not getting enough feed, but they're also not using those muscles to develop them correctly. A peaky, hard, and I'm thinking the muscles look so strappy and so pulled when I'm thinking of a horse that's really just pulling their legs, and it's because they're using their legs incorrectly.
Other things that I was looking into in regards to being on the bit was I kind of looked at how the rider should be riding the horse. It's hard for a lot of riders, myself included, to really imagine the feel, like how we were talking about earlier, because they've never experienced it before. How are you supposed to imagine and seek out this feeling if you don't know what the feeling is? And so one of the things that gets frustrating, because it happens to a lot of riders, is you end up blocking the horse's energy with your hands or your seat. And it's just, on the bit think of the circle. You have a circle of energy moving where the energy is allowed to come up, go over the top, exit, and then come back around. And a lot of times either a rider is breaking the straight line from bit to elbow with their hands, or they just have a very stiff seat and it's halting that energy somewhere and it breaks up that impulsion.
No, and I absolutely agree with you. And I'm actually I kind of blame some of this on the language that was used in a lot of books previously. So a lot of books that I've read from the 50s and 60s, and the terminology they're using is almost cringeworthy, but you have to actually read the passage and read the paragraph in complete context and understand that they're using terms fixed hands and braced back. And while those sound to me horrible and totally cringy, and I think riders are taking brace back and fixed hands and turning it into something that's not. They're using the term of fixed hands to say that the rider's hand is constant and not that it's not moving up and down. It's constantly on that contact. It's constantly supporting. And they use the term fixed hands, and that's not what they mean. The hand isn't stuck in place. Fixed hands to me is something that is more common in performance discipline, where your horse is trained with draw reins and they're trained to just hit the end of the rein length and drop their head. And so I kind of have to blame some of this maybe on how things were described previously in some of the previous terminology, because fixed hands and braced back sound horrible. But if you actually read these books and try to understand what they're saying, they're not saying fixed hands, they're not saying braced back, they're saying supportive core and supporting hands.
Right, and that's another part over on the bit terminology probably really confuses people, because on the bit is strictly focusing on the front half of the horse, their mouth, the bit portion specifically. It doesn't acknowledge the back end of the horse just in that 3 little words.
Yeah, and that's, I think, why I'm not in love with the term, but I don't hate the term because I understand the term. But it does, like you said, it implies that we're only looking at the front half of the horse. And really what the term is trying to say is that the horse has come from the back to be able to be on the bit and be able to meet you at the bit, essentially. And it's not starting at the bit. It's this meeting of rider and horse at the point of the bit, if that makes sense.
One of my favorite things is always I've said, I don't know if anyone else has ever said this, I say it, I don't know if I stole it off somebody, but I'm going to give myself credit for this one, is I always say it you want the horse on the bit, not the bit on the horse.
Yeah.
So you're not bringing the bit back to the horse. You're pushing them onto the bit.
Right, and this goes back, one of my big breakthroughs, went to a couple different clinics. Some of the big breakthroughs I had was hearing this idea of your hands are pushing forward. Your hands are never to take back. Your only cue with your hands is to push them forward and to have your horse meet your hands out there. And that, I think, is really important.
Do you know how hard it is, though? Anybody, your next ride, go out and just ask for a forward transition or any transition without pulling back on your reins, or turning without pulling back on your reins. You know how hard that is? I struggle with it every single day.
It is so hard, and because the thing with riding is that your natural instinct is wrong. Right? You want to use your hands. We are hand heavy as humans. Humans are developed to be hand heavy, with everything we do, we rely mostly on our hands. We don't rely on our feet, to do everyday tasks except for walking us around. But like our hands are how we do everything. And so when it comes to horses, we see the same mistake being made, is that we become a hand heavy as humans and as riders. We rely solely on our hands. But if we're hand heavy, then how do we feel the bit? How do we feel the lightness? How do we, you can't be hand heavy. You have to be so much softer and lighter in your hands.
Yes, 100%. It's them opposable thumbs. They really get you.
Yes, right. There's an illusion there that your hands are the solution to all problems, and they're not. You really have to rely more on your seat. And this is something that I think the Germans have been noted on for many, many years, as they rely almost exclusively on their seat and their back. They really see their back as one of their training aids. And to me, again, when I hear the word back, I think it's the core. You're using your back as a steering aid, but you're steering your back with your core. And this is really seen as an aid. And when you come into the American school of thought, we don't talk about core being one of your natural aids. We talk about seat and legs, but I also think your core is independent of your seat and legs, and that your core is its own individual aid that should be used and should be relied on.
Yes. 100%.
So I think we're going to talk a little bit now about some of the causes and the arguments people have for hyperflexion. And this kind of really starts off where I wanted to start the conversation, was with the books, with the historical definition of on the bit and imagery versus today's definition of on the bit and imagery. I think in the 2000s, we saw a huge shift in what on the bit was. And I think there's a lot of reasons, a lot of things we can poke at as being the reason of this. When I'm looking through, so a lot of the books I have that I rely on, that I love, are books that are from either the 80s or the 90s or much earlier. One of my books that I need to spend more time with, because it's just a masterpiece, is The Principles of Riding. It is the official instruction handbook of the German National Equestrian Federation. This is one of the required readings for if you want to become a dressage judge, an FEI dressage judge, is this Principles of Riding book. And I really, really like it. I need to read more of it. But this book, I think originally, let me look at the date. So the first publication of this book was 1985, and then it was republished 91, 92, 94, 96, 97, and the version I have is from 97. But when you look at it and you look at how they define on the bit, the horse's nose is in front of vertical. The horse's nose is several inches in front of vertical. Being on the bit and being on the vertical are not the same thing. Being on the vertical is collection, and somehow we've lost this. So if you look at books from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, you will see on the bit with the horse's nose in front of vertical. And somewhere around the 2000s, this changed. And it's changed, I think, in part due to the horses we're riding. I think our breeds have really changed. Prior to the 2000s, we didn't have this explosion of imported warm bloods. This was really the time, especially in eventing prior to 2000s. The thoroughbred was king. Everyone rode a thoroughbred, and thoroughbreds don't have this huge, crusty, warm blood neck. They are different horses and different movers. And so when we were talking about on the bit for a thoroughbred and for these lighter bodied horses, it wasn't on the vertical. And for whatever reason, I think the warm blood has really changed this in our dressage world.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also, I think imagery that we constantly see being shared and posted, the constant pictures of like the top dressage riders, you see Eventing Nation or, USEF, they share these beautiful images of these horses in these Grand Prix tests. And they typically will take the beautiful snapshot of either they're doing their lengthening or they have come up for a collection movement where they're, doing, piaffe passage, one of those. And the snapshot is right there where they're in the moment of collection. And so their horse is on the vertical. And everyone will see that. And as it trickles down, people want to look like that. And so they skip all the in-between steps and they just put their horse on the vertical constantly the entire time because they don't understand. They don't understand the difference or what happened in that one picture.
Yeah, and that's the hard thing when you're looking at a photo only captures a moment, and it doesn't capture, the following moments. Is this a sustained position the horse is being ridden in, or is this just a temporary moment? And absolutely, those collection photos, if you Google dressage images, you're looking at a ton of advanced level horses performing piafs and pirouettes and passage because, well, that looks really pretty in a photo. And when we're seeing that, I think us as riders, we want to emulate top riders. And I think this is something that, Charlotte and Isabel and Carl have all been called out on, and I don't know their exact justification for it or exactly why they feel that this is okay. But when those are the riders you're looking up to and you see their horses behind the vertical, I think it's just this, you're becoming numb to it and you say, well, if they can do it, I can do it. They're winning. They're proving that this is an effective strategy and they're winning with it, which is really disappointing. So I want to share a study I found that I thought was fascinating, and it is actually available for free download to anyone who wants to read it. I cannot pronounce the authors' names. I just can't pronounce names. Names isn't my thing. I'm really sorry, but it was done by 3 ladies from Germany. So they were looking at dressage competitions in Germany who are all university employees that were doing this research study. And what they wanted to look at was the prevalence of hyper-flexion in competition horses. So it's actually 2 parts to this study. One part is looking at the relation of this position to behavior and to performance marks, but also what is its prevalence in competitions. And so they were in Germany, keep that in mind, which, we do tout Germany as being perfection, but I don't think they are any less affected by this riding style than those in other countries. But what they found was that, first off, this riding style of being behind the vertical was very prevalent in the warm-up arena. We're talking in this case right now, upper-level FEI horses. They looked at both upper-level doing, after 4th level, that's what I'm trying to say, after 4th level, as well as lower-level riders. So the upper-level riders who are competing above 4th level were very frequently seen using behind the vertical in the warm-up arena. When they would go into the arena to ride in competition, they stopped and put the horse on vertical. And this is partly due to how FEI defines the frame a horse should be ridden in 2010. They cleaned up the definition. And so in theory, these riders, when they go into the ring to ride their upper level test, should be penalized for being behind the vertical. They are not being penalized. Judges are giving high marks to these riders who are competing above 4th level. But the opposite is happening for those riders below 4th level. In this study, they found that riders who were riding at the lower levels were being penalized for behind the vertical, where those above 4th level were being rewarded. And if you're watching riders who are riding above 4th level, as most of us, right, that's who we want. I don't watch a ton of, training level riders to look up to because, they look a lot like me, right? We want to look and watch the best riders in the world who are riding and competing at the upper levels. They are getting awarded for this behind the vertical frame where their rules clearly say they can't be there. They're getting the points for it and the scores for it, and us lower level riders are being penalized for it. So I think that's a really interesting double standard that's occurring.
Another thing that I wanted to look at, or I want to look into, it's going to be his whole own episode, is just kind of how the Dressage Federation has changed their rules or changed some of their scores and their markings, that it favors people riding behind the vertical or riding a little bit incorrectly, and it puts those that are riding on the bit or the horse not always on vertical, it puts them at a disadvantage.
This is something that, right, is being still constantly debated. You have people very strongly on each side of the aisle with this, is the removal of the collective marks. The collective marks were removed for FEI level tests a couple years ago, and you have people very active on both sides of the camp saying, no, this is totally fine. This gives the judge the ability to be more critical during the test and during each movement, which should be what's happening. That absolutely should be the goal and the outcome. I do agree with that view. The problem is we're not seeing judges being more critical. We're seeing judges allow, and almost because they have to, when you see rider after rider come in with, this exaggerated hind end movement that's not correct. When you see rider after rider come in that's hyper-flexed behind the vertical, you're almost forced to reward it because everyone is doing it. And with the lack of the collective marks, you don't have one place anymore to call it out for what it is. And you kind of have to give them the points in the movement because, well, they're doing it mostly correct, right?
Yeah.
Like if everyone's doing it, you kind of have to go with it. And whether this is because judges think they have to go with it or because judges' mindsets are changing on what's acceptable, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not in a judge's mind when they're watching. Like no one will ever know for sure what that feeling is or what they really are thinking because it's so in the moment. When you're a judge watching a test, it's so hard to like kind of sometimes re-explain what's going on even as the judge later. But I think losing those collective marks, it really actually, I think, affects those riders that are just making that transition at a fourth level, that have gotten away with a lot at fourth level, and they are no longer able to really call it out for what it is. And that's poor gait quality, a lack of impulsion, a lack of submission. I mean, those things are gone. They're no longer collective marks for paces, impulsion, or submission, and instead there's one collective mark that's left for rider or athlete's position in the correct use of their aids. And I think this is great, but I really don't, I just don't love it. What they hoped would happen is that judges would get stricter in each movement so that those watching could better understand what was happening, instead of what actually is happening is the judges are rewarding the bad riding in the moment instead.
Yeah, and it's hard because I don't know enough really to be able to speak on it. But what I have seen, and when I go to competitions and stuff, is that whoever's riding behind the vertical or a little bit slightly hyper-flexed, they're cleaning up. They're doing super well. Whereas others that are riding not in that position are not doing anywhere near as well as they are.
Yeah, and that's what's frustrating. And I think, you're constantly, when you're not scoring well, you're going to look and say, well, what is everyone else doing? Oh, well, everyone else is there, so I have to be there as well. And that's one of those things is I think dressage right now is at a crossroads. We have to decide as a community or just as individuals, what do we put first? Getting a good score or our horse's well-being? And I think we've seen this. We know exactly the rider in the barn that does this is they really get aggressive during their ride and really push their horse to a level they shouldn't be or are almost abusive. But then they get off and reward the horse with a carrot and therapy and pasture. And they do all these things and think, well, overall, I'm supporting my horse's care. Overall, I'm a good rider and a kind horse owner. Overall, I'm putting my horse's well-being first. But you have to do that in every moment.
Yes.
For it to count.
Yeah, it can't just be a 50% of the time you're caring for their well-being because that's not how it works. It's not how it goes.
No, it's not. And like as a rider, one of my biggest fears is a rider and training on the ground, everything I do with my horses, is that I'm going to cause learned helplessness from them. That I'm going to push them. I mean, even I sometimes get afraid that I'm going to do this when I'm like working them on the ground or like doing flagging exercises and desensitization exercises, that I want to make sure my horse is accepting and good with what we're doing versus just sort of shutting down and accepting it. And I think that's what we see a lot of times in dressage horses. And there may have been a lecture or two about this at the dressage conference about learned helplessness being the reason for dull horses. And why we're seeing, lackluster performances from some of these horses is because they are basically broken and their spirit is broken and they're dull because they have learned to just accept the pain and know they can't get away from it. So that's why it's so important that well-being, that idea of a horse's well-being is 100% of the time, not 50 or 60 or 90% of the time.
That's not a position I ever want to put my own horse in. I don't want to see any horse in that position. And it's so hard because I think we've all seen horses in those positions, and their riders are not doing it intentionally all the time. It can happen on accident, and they think that just the reward after the ride is enough, and just giving them, the proper care and treatment to maintain their livelihood is enough, when in reality, it has to be applied to every aspect of their lives.
I would say most of the riders who are guilty of riding behind the vertical are doing it on accident or are doing it because they think it is okay. So riding, in front of the vertical and being on the bit those were linked, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I'm not making this up, or I'm not that extreme that I don't want my horse to be ridden on the bit. I'm not at all that kind of person, but I was interested in seeing what the other side of the aisle thought when it came to hyperflexion. So I did spend a bit of time in some chat rooms and some forums looking at their arguments. And so these arguments really bother me. So one of them is that it's acceptable to do this in a moment. So let it be a young horse that does not yet, and I'm quoting someone else, sorry guys. So let it be the young horse that does not yet have the muscle to carry itself properly or has balance issues, or an older horse that needs to be worked rounder since it does not seek true contact and carries itself stiffly. A horse that comes behind the vertical may still engage its core, step underneath itself, and move over the back. So a lot of the argument is that, well, we're just going to do it in a moment. We're just going to do it for a warm-up. We're just going to do it for this little phase. And at the end of the day, it's not doing what you think it's doing. It's not engaging the horse's core. A horse can only stretch so much, and you're causing the horse discomfort. So is that discomfort worth it for one moment? Probably not. And it's still also an evasion tactic. Like, the horse is still evading the bit. So this argument that it's okay for just a moment really bothers me.
It also bothers me, the comment of a young horse unable to balance themselves, you'd ride them there. Because that's certainly not going to help them balance themselves.
No, it's only going to pull them further onto the forehand, and they're not going to be learning to load their haunches. And loading their haunches is really, really hard, and it causes a lot of stress on the body. So it's something that needs to be taken time with, and yes, a younger horse isn't going to be able to do it immediately, but it is something that you have to work on and focus on, and letting them do the opposite is not going to build more strength on the haunches.
It's a slippery slope. Once you say, in this moment, it's okay, the next time you're going to say, in these other moments, it's also okay. And now suddenly your entire warm-up is it.
Right. And I mean, that's exactly how a habit is created. A habit is something you do repeatedly over and over. And so the more times you allow it, the more it's going to happen. So one of the other arguments I saw, which I don't 100% disagree with this argument, but I do think it needs to be sort of taken in context, is that on the other side, there are plenty of ponies on the vertical and ahead of the vertical that shuffle around with a floppy core and a U-shaped back. Why does hyperflexion get demonized when the later does not receive harsh judgment? So for this, I think they're actually talking about two totally different things. First off, a small pony that wants to trot around with its nose out is a perfectly happy pony. Like, right? He's totally fine. And even big horses do this, but I think we all can imagine that perfectly fat little pony with a kid on it. They'll just be bopping around the arena. There's nothing wrong with that. That horse is fine. But there is a difference between a horse that is stressed and has their head above the vertical and their back dropped out. And this is usually caused by pain. And I think we can all agree that pain is not okay. So yes, if your horse is because they have too big of a rider or poor saddle fit, or they're super anxious and not relaxed, throwing their head up and riding above the bit is also like totally bad. Don't do that. Like, you have to solve this issue just as much as you need to solve the behind the bit issue.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot quicker. People jump on it and fix it when they see the horse completely hollow with their head stuck up in the air. It's not, no one is standing there saying this is okay, this is good. Where on the offside, I think with hyperflexion is a lot of times people will say a little bit of it is okay. And sometimes they say that it's fine. Whereas when the horse is hollow, people are immediately saying, no, correct that. And then they correct it with overflexion.
Right. And to me, when I see a horse that's hollow, that is like the beginning. That's where you're starting from, and you're going to address this problem. Where hyperflexion is like the end often. And that's where people have purposely ridden to. No person purposely, most horse people, saddle seat's its own discussion, but like most people don't purposely ride their horse to be hollow, to throw their head up in the air, to drop their back out. Like, that is not where people are purposely riding their horse to. Where hyperflexion, you've actively chosen to go there.
Yes. What other arguments were people having?
The other one that I'm seeing a lot is this. It's a warm-up technique. So, right, like that stretch conversation we were having. And this is where you're going to see people like Charlotte and Isabel and Carl getting in a lot of trouble because they do use this method in the warm-up arena. And it's used as like, I don't know, I'm going to get deep flexion now, and then my horse will be more likely to stay in a correct position during the test. And I think it just, that argument, well, this is where I personally got stuck in it myself a couple years ago, and thought that, oh yeah, it makes sense to do it now. We know that our horses' bodies only can flex and bend so much before you're going the opposite direction. So just because they're top riders doesn't justify it. And I'm not a top rider. I don't pretend to be. I also don't pretend to know why they choose this method or what the justification is. I didn't go down that rabbit hole yet.
Right, we're not in their barns. We're not seeing them riding every single day. It's just what we have seen.
Yeah, what we have seen is them doing this method specifically in the warm-up arena and then going to that FEI approved position. And that, just so we're aware, the FEI does define it as the head should remain in a steady position as a rule, slightly in front of vertical with a supple pull at the highest point of the neck, and no resistance should be offered to the athlete. So even the FEI defines it as having that pull being the highest point of the neck, and why they get rewarded for being lower than that, I do not know.
I mean, it's just a picture that's constantly pressed on us that eventually you think and you see it and you say, oh, that's beautiful. It's what you're supposed to have, when it's not. And I think a lot of times when you look back at those old pictures and you look back on old, like, burly badminton photos or dressage tests, the old days, a lot of times the horses were not anywhere near the positions that we're riding them in now. And yes, we have come a long way in our horsemanship and our riding and overall techniques of just not running your horse straight into a pond. You know, we've come a long ways, but
yes,
a lot of stuff that happened previously, some of it was good that we didn't necessarily need to move away from.
And that is like where I go back to my original point of, I think the warm blood has left a lot of confusion in the dressage world. That the introduction of this warm blood who has a bigger, crustier neck naturally, is more likely to be round than the thoroughbred, has made people think on the bit and on the vertical are the same thing, and that's where you need to be. And your horse, and I disagree completely. On the vertical is like the highest form of collection. Your horse should not go beyond should be on the vertical in those high collection movements, and not throughout your regular ride. And I think if you're starting with on the bit as being on the vertical, well, then where do you go for collection? And I think that's where there's a lot of confusion, is that you're looking at these riders who are riding at the top level and saying, well, then that's how my training level horse needs to move. That's how my intro level horse needs to move. And that is not true. Yes, you may score well because your horse is riding above the level, and it may be rewarded well because your horse looks, like they're above the level. But if you didn't actually put the training in to get there, if your horse doesn't also have impulsion and straightness and proper contact, then you cheated and you're not actually there.
Yes, and I know it feels like we're picking on dressage riders right now, but it's not just that. I have seen, think about upper level show jumpers, when they're going on their straightaways or in between the jumps. They are really overflexing their horses, getting them round, just working with that overflexion to keep them soft in between the jumps. And that, I think, has gotten a lot more distinct and become a trend over the years, especially with show jumpers, where previously you saw the horse might not have been right, but previously you saw them, with their head up a little bit more. They might be coming into the jumps a little bit more hollow.
Yeah, I think this is a problem with almost all riding disciplines. There are definitely riding disciplines that this can be excused from because there's not a focus on headset, such as like trail riding and endurance. And even I'm going to excuse stock seat equitation and stock seat performance for quarter horses, not for Arabs, but for quarter horses, I'm going to excuse them from this conversation. Not that they don't have their own issues going on with headsets, but I think there's a couple disciplines we can excuse from this. But everyone else is part of this conversation. And this doesn't just apply to dressage horses. This applies to anyone who's ever overflexed their horse.
Yeah, and it's just something that we need to become more aware of and not just immediately dismissing it and saying, I don't do this. Because the chances are we all do it to a slight degree. And we just have to correct that. We have to be aware of it. And as soon as it happens, we need to correct it.
So I want to mention a couple of studies that I did look up, trying to figure out, just trying to figure out what the research is when it comes to hyperflexion. And this is actually an area of research where we've actually spent some effort and some time, which I'm really appreciative of. up to 2010, there was really a gap in the research where people were just sort of looking at it as good, bad. And then after 2010, we really saw like a shift of people saying, okay, we think it's bad. Why is it bad? How do we know it's bad? And so I found a lot of studies that looked at the effects of hyper-flexion on the horse's behavior and basically their stress responses. And it was found in like study after study after study that horses that were being ridden in this hyper-flex position were showing increased heart rate. They were showing tail swishing, ear pinning, gapping in the mouth. They were showing flared nostrils. They were showing signs of pain and discomfort in study after study. And this was even, this wasn't horse's head to the chest. These studies also found that same stress was being indicated when the horse was in that really neck high position and their back was dropped out. And this is different than that plunky little pony trotting around the arena. This is a horse that we can think of that really hot thoroughbred who's like melting down. Yes, their head's way up and they're stressed as well. So study after study has found that the most comfortable position for a horse is at the vertical or slightly in front of it, between a sort of natural position where their head's more around the wither, that lower position, a more natural carriage to their head, maybe a foot up, maybe not 2 feet up, but like that natural to where we see or think of on the bit correctly being, if that makes sense. That range is where the horse is most happy and most comfortable, and study after study supports that.
So what do we do with that information? Just stop. It's hard when you hear all these research and everything because we know it stresses them out. We know it's hard on their bodies. So how do you make people stop?
So I think we just have to become more and more conscious of it in our everyday riding, and we need to. As a rider, you have to make that decision. What's more important, my score in this moment or my horse's comfort? And I think this is something we have to stop doing in day-to-day training. We have to stop letting our horse get to a point where they fall behind the vertical, and we have to make sure that we properly understand what being on the bit is, and that being on the bit is a more advanced level movement. Like you said, this is after 4 steps on the training pyramid, can we begin to get our horse on the bit? This is not, we don't start on the bit and then get these other things. We have to start with impulsion, with straightness, with relaxation, and then we get on the bit. So changing when we're getting on the bit, I think, is really crucial to our horse's development. And I think it's unfortunate sometimes that we're seeing these young horse classes being promoted, because I think we're seeing being on the bit and having a round neck as being evidence of a good ride.
I cannot remember the last time I saw a young horse pick or in these young horse classes and groups being pushed that they were not being ridden behind the vertical. And it's almost every single, like you see people riding their 3-year-olds, their 4-year-olds, every single one of them almost, they're behind the vertical slightly. It's not by a huge degree, but they're behind the vertical. And it's there. And it's this training that starts right from the very get-go, right from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, we all have seen the Facebook image, right, that talks about, or I guess it's an image, but Facebook gets shared a lot there, that the horse's back, right, doesn't fuse until they're about 6 years old. So if your back isn't done growing and developing until you're 6, how are you able to fully lift, carry, and develop self-carriage if you're not done growing, right? Because we know how hard it is for a rider to go through a growth spurt, and they have to relearn everything. Horses are just the same way. They have to relearn how to use their bodies every time it changes on them.
Yes.
I guess for the final part of this episode is I just want to share some of the techniques we use while we're riding in order to make sure our horses are moving in a correct position. So one of my favorite things to do is to drop my stirrups and give my horse a good tickle in the tummy. And while like my leg position has to change and my legs are technically not correct, it's a good way, especially with a horse that's really stiff in the back, to try to get to say we're starting with the back and then your neck will adjust from there when you wrap those legs around and ask them truly to lift their stomach up into their back. I enjoy doing this, especially at the walk, just to make sure that we all are on the same page kind of thing.
That's cute. I like that.
And I have long enough legs that I can do it, I think. That helps.
Yes, I don't. I cannot do that.
Yes, and I love riding a good short horse. So my long legs on a pony, like, there was a school pony I used to ride, and the girls, like, all the school kids would get on him, and he would just be a giraffe, and he would just be a pain in the butt. He'd act like a little llama, a little giraffe, drop out his back, and just basically rip around the arena to get away from everyone. And every time I got on him and I started getting with the older girls, like, who had long enough legs, it's like, just wrap your legs around his tummy until he drops his head. Like, don't pull on his head, don't touch his mouth. But if you just tickle him in the tummy until he drops his head, then you've got his whole body engaged, and he immediately relaxes and cannot rip that bit from you. But it's hard work for them to hold their back up there. So you can only do this for a second or two. But it's the same thing as doing like a tummy lift on the ground where you tickle them with your fingers or like curry comb or something to get them to lift. The other big thing to do is when you find your horse falling behind vertical and the pole dropping is to reset. Like, legs on, soften your reins. You need to do a half halt, rebalance your horse, make sure they're on their haunches, and basically reset the position. Don't, it's really hard to get them to go right back to being on the vertical or in front of the vertical if you don't just kind of start from scratch, if that makes sense. And the last little one I want to talk about, well, I guess one more. Stretchy, chewy circles, relaxation exercises, and conditioning. So building that top line, your horse cannot support themselves if they don't have the top line to do it. So a lot of conditioning work needs to go in. And if you're finding your horse frequently falling behind the bit and frequently trying to evade it, go back to conditioning work and long and low where their nose is out, not where their nose is deep.
I think conditioning work, a lot more emphasis should be put on that every day with people riding.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. If you don't have the muscles to do the work, how are you going to do the work?
Exactly.
And then this is an interesting strategy. I have a lot of thoughts on it. It is so I'm trying to figure out how to like explain this. So if you guys know what a demi-arrête is, which is being incorrectly defined currently on the internet. There is a trend right now to use demi-arrête as a way to get the horse out of, or a way to define a technique for getting the horse out of behind the bit. And basically what's being promoted is you like lift your hands a little bit, you kind of tickle their mouth with the bit and get them to kind of lift their head up off the bit, which I would rather see you just drop contact and start from scratch than pulling them out of being behind the bit, because I don't think that actually works. You're still just riding off of your hands instead of going back to the haunches where the problem is.
That's something I think that's being taught a lot, is just lift your hands more. They start going behind the vertical, lift your hands.
Yeah, and this demi-arrête, and I'm so sorry if I'm butchering demi-arrête. It's French. I don't know how to pronounce French words. But this is like the new thing right now. The new thing is, if my horse falls behind the vertical, I lift my hands and tickle the edge of their mouth with the bit, or like vibrate the bit. And you're not addressing the true problem, which is that your horse actually fell behind your leg, dropped its back, and is evading at this point. You're just playing with the bit, and this is still riding your horse front to back instead of back to front. But the real confusion with this is that the term demi-arrête is French for half halt, which is what you should be doing. A half halt is where you and rider and horse rebalance. It has nothing to do with wiggling the bit. A half halt is not wiggling the bit. A half halt is re-engaging everybody's core, everybody getting back to the center of balance. And so I don't know where this came from and why there's this confusion or this using this term. This term, demi-arrête, means half halt in French. You should be doing a half halt to get your horse back in front of the vertical. You should not be doing this new definition, which is wiggling and lifting your hands.
That's interesting. Things get misinterpreted all the time, and that when someone tells you to slightly wiggle a bit or, play with your reins left to right and it turns into seesawing, things get misconstrued all the time and taken out of context. A topic for another time.
Yeah, a topic for another time. But just remember, guys, a bit is metal, and a wiggling, moving, jerking bit is not going to get your horse soft through the back. No. They're going to want to evade and get away from that real quick. So, yes, there is play on the reins when you're riding correctly, very minute, very soft. I'm not saying this definition from Demaret translates to seesawing, and this new definition are two different things, but keep the bit still. A horse is more likely to ride towards it if it's still and soft versus it jerking and moving around.
Right, and the way to get your horse relaxed in the back is not to use their face.
Correct. Putting them on the forehand, getting them hyperflex is not going to help the back at all. So I think that is all I have for this topic right now. There are so many rabbit holes that we can go down with this topic, and so many different ways to approach it. But I just really, really wanted to start addressing that modern style of riding, and that we've got to knock it off, or just accept that we don't care anymore and continue.
I prefer the option of let's all stop. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for sticking with us and listening to our podcast today. If you have any questions or if you want to keep up with us, you can follow us on Instagram at mudstudsskullcaps. If you have any topics or questions you want to ask us, you can send us an email at mudstudsskullcaps@gmail.com.
And if you are using Apple iTunes or that Apple Podcast, go ahead and leave a 5-star review so other people can find us, so we can start to climb the charts a little bit and get promoted as a fun, horsey podcast for others to listen to. And remember, that review is for others, so they know that we're awesome, or somewhat awesome, or medium awesome, whatever you're feeling, no pressure. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our episodes that come out every week.
Stay safe, stay classy, and stay in the saddle.
Bye.
Bye.